June 30th, 1960. The Belgian King Baudouin delivers an address in Leopoldville, the capital of the newly independent Republic of the Congo. In his speech, the king makes a series of patronizing remarks toward his former colonial subjects and praises the actions of King Leopold II, the Belgian monarch who killed millions in the latter part of the 19th century. Almost immediately after the new republic's flag was raised and the Belgians departed, the new Republic of the Congo descended into chaos. For the next few years, violence and political instability became the new norm. This is just one instance of a larger pattern of bloodshed and widespread poverty throughout the continent. What happened? For starters, the African continent is by no means a monolith. In fact, the opposite is true. That being said, there are a number of factors that have either inhibited or facilitated the economic and political development of the various nation-states of Africa. Geography, for instance, plays an important part in Africa's development. Slavery and colonialism, likewise, have left their horrific scars on the continent. Before we can analyze Africa's current state or examine the impact of the past, we need to look at the geographical factors at play. First, much of the African continent is inhospitable for cattle domestication. The tsetse fly inhabits most of sub-Saharan Africa. These flies carry trypanosomiasis, which is lethal to livestock. This is only one factor, however. Historian Richard Reed says, the relative regularity of Africa's coastline and the infrequency of natural harbors, with the notable exception of the Mediterranean coast, meant the absence in general of the armed ocean-going fleets so prominent in Western European and East Asian military history. Climate change has also impacted African development. Richard Reed would write, vulnerable to significant variations in rainfall, moreover, has long been a key driver of conflict. He continues with, the defining dynamic in a great deal of African war, in antiquity as in more recent times, has been the quest for proximity to water. Slavery has had a profound impact on Africa's demographics. The death and enslavement of millions of Africans during the slave trade deprived the continent of necessary human capital. Slavery also contributed to ethnic conflict and political instability on the continent due to the constant threats of danger. Africans, living in fear of kidnapping and enslavement, would obtain weapons for personal protection from European traders in exchange for slaves, further perpetuating the slave trade. Until the late 19th century, European penetration into Africa was limited mostly to the coasts. The European colonizers were no monolith either. The European countries who engaged in the scramble for Africa all had their own ways of business, and realities on the ground were not always the same. At the time of Ghana's independence from Britain in 1957, she was the leading producer of the world's cocoa. She also had an advanced education system and the biggest pool of skilled laborers out of any African colony. Things could not be more different in the Belgian Congo. There was a profound lack of skilled personnel among the African population. Only 3 civil servants out of 1,400 were Congolese. By 1960, only 30 Congolese had graduated from college. There were no Congolese officers in the force publique. There were also no Congolese doctors or secondary school teachers. The Belgian colonial authorities actively suppressed the growth of an indigenous intellectual class. Léopold Senghor of Senegal and Félix Houphouët-Boigny of Côte d'Ivoire both favored retaining ties to their former colonial master, France. Côte d'Ivoire in particular had the advantage of being a leading producer of cocoa and coffee. For the French colonies in Africa, there were advantages to remaining attached to France. The French government spent considerable sums of money on schools, infrastructure, and more. Also, the French sent subsidies to their African colonies for export crops. In the southern portion of Africa, most notably in what are today South Africa and Zimbabwe, the white colonial classes in those countries remained entrenched for a little while longer than their counterparts in other African states. On November 11, 1965, the white settler class of the former British colony of Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, had unilaterally declared independence under the leadership of Ian Smith. Their aim was to keep the European-dominated power structure in place. At the time, Britain had adopted the policy of Nibmar, no independence before majority African rule. Rhodesia, diplomatically isolated, fought a counterinsurgency campaign against African nationalist guerrillas for more than a decade. In 1980, African nationalist leader Robert Mugabe became the leader of the new Zimbabwe. Mugabe's regime was characterized by authoritarianism and economic looting. Rhodesia's neighbor, South Africa, had adopted a similar siege mentality. The system of apartheid, developed by Hendrik Verwoerd, was an extremely complicated racist system designed to protect the privileged position of South Africa's white minority. Growing civil unrest, a two-decade-long war in the form of the South African Border War, and economic as well as diplomatic isolation resulted in the eventual collapse of the apartheid system. Nelson Mandela was elected as South Africa's first black president in 1994. Today, South Africa has one of the biggest economies in Africa. However, the Rainbow Nation faces its own set of challenges. According to a 2019 article by the World Economic Forum, Africa faces 5 major challenges to its development: unemployment and underemployment, climate change, political change, fiscal crises, and underinvestment in infrastructure. According to UN figures, 490 million people live on less than $1.90 a day as of 2021. Additionally, less than half of all African countries have experienced inclusive growth between 2000 and 2020. Inclusive growth is defined by the OECD as economic growth that is distributed fairly across society and creates opportunities for all. Also, the conflict in Ukraine has driven another 1.8 million people into extreme poverty in 2022. However, it's not all doom and gloom for Africa. In the midst of great hardship and suffering, there has also been hope and meaningful change. The island nation of Mauritius has the highest Human Development Index ranking in Africa and is 66th worldwide out of 189 countries. The North African Arab states, such as Algeria, Egypt, and Tunisia, are also fairly prosperous compared to the rest of the continent. Nigeria is the continent's largest economy and most populous country. Her oil wealth also gives her more clout on the world stage. Kenya is the largest economy in East Africa and a major transport hub. Botswana in Southern Africa is a case of good governance and responsible economic policy. The profits from Botswana's diamond wealth have been invested in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. As a whole, Africa's population is growing faster than any other continent. The African continent is also growing faster than the rest of the world economically. Africa's population is also younger on average compared to the other continents. Africa has faced a great deal of challenges, and although there is still much work to be done, the continent has come a long way. What do you guys think? How do you think Africa will look in the coming decades? Will we see an African superpower? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.